She said it was a book club, but why were there 3 firefighters? When John came home earlier than usual, he had no idea this evening would change his life. As he entered the house, he heard laughter and muffled voices coming from the living room. His wife, Sarah, had often mentioned wanting to start a book club with her friends, but something about the laughter felt different. John took off his shoes and quietly approached the living room door. He saw 3 men in firefighter uniforms sitting around the table. Sarah, dressed in an elegant red dress she usually reserved for special occasions, was pouring wine. On the table lay a single book that looked untouched. The atmosphere seemed far too relaxed for a literary discussion. "So, do you really think the protagonist should have risked everything?" one of the men asked, laughing heartily. Sarah raised her glass and playfully winked. "It all depends on what he stands to lose." John felt his heart race. Something was off. Unable to resist, he stepped into the room. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. Sarah turned to him, looking slightly surprised but quickly regaining her composure. "John, you're home early. This is the book club. Tonight's topic is, compassion in extreme situations. Meet Tom, Brian, and Luke. They're firefighters." "Firefighters?" John looked at them, unable to hide his suspicion. The men seemed far too comfortable in his living room, as if they'd been there before. "Yes, we're discussing a book about heroism," one of the men explained, but his smile seemed a bit too self-assured. John felt unease rising within him, but decided not to make a scene. He nodded and headed to the kitchen. There, he sat down, trying to collect his thoughts. His intuition screamed that this wasn't just a book club. An hour later, he heard the men say their goodbyes, and the door closed. Sarah entered the kitchen, looking unusually calm. "You seem tense. What's wrong?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of water. "Nothing, just tired." "Are you sure it was a book club?" John asked, striving to keep his tone even. Sarah smiled, but her eyes avoided his. "Of course. What else would it be?" John felt the need to uncover the truth. But how? Late that night, John sat in the dark, holding Sarah's phone in his hands. His heart pounded, but he steadied himself and unlocked the screen. The first thing he noticed was a message from Tom, one of the firefighters. "Can't wait for the next meeting. Will your husband be home?" John felt his breath catch. He scrolled through their chat history. There were jokes and playful messages, but nothing explicitly incriminating. However, a few phrases stood out. "You make me forget everything. Tomorrow will be even hotter than last time." John opened the photo gallery. Among dozens of ordinary pictures, he found a few of Sarah with Tom in uniform. They sat close together, laughing. One photo was taken in the kitchen, and in the background, he noticed the other 2 firefighters raising their glasses. The unease in John's chest turned to anger. He didn't know what to do, but suddenly the phone buzzed in his hands. A new message from Tom. "Tonight was unforgettable. You looked stunning in that dress. Let me know when we can do it again." John's hands clenched into fists. His mind flooded with questions. How far had this gone? What else didn't he know? He decided not to confront Sarah yet. Instead, the next morning, after she left for errands, John drove to the local fire station. When he entered, a smiling firefighter greeted him. "Here for a tour?" he asked, unsuspecting of John's true intentions. "No, I'm looking for Tom," John replied, keeping his emotions in check. "Tom's out on a call. He'll be back in a couple of hours." John nodded and decided to wait. As he sat in the lobby, trying to hide his agitation, another firefighter, Luke, one of the men from his house, approached him. "Hey, you look like Sarah's husband," Luke said, sitting down next to him. John's stomach tightened. Luke didn't look guilty, but there was a confidence in his tone that unsettled John. "Yes, I'm her husband. Do you have something to say to her?" John asked, trying to remain calm. Luke laughed. "No, nothing serious. She's just a charismatic woman. You know how it is." John felt his patience waning. He wanted to press further, but at that moment, Tom walked in. "John, right? What brings you here?" Their eyes met, and in that gaze, more was said than any words could express. That evening, John sat in his office, analyzing everything that had happened. Sarah returned home as casually as ever. She smiled, greeted him, and mentioned she was planning another meeting with the club tomorrow. "Those guys again?" John asked, looking directly into her eyes. "Yes, why not? They're interesting people," she replied without flinching. John decided not to escalate things this time, but he knew that next time, he would be there to find out everything for himself. The following evening, John decided to stay home during the next book club meeting. He sat in the kitchen, pretending to be occupied with his own work while Sarah poured wine and arranged snacks. She looked overly confident, even bold, which only fueled his suspicions. When the doorbell rang, Sarah, dressed in her favorite black dress, hurried to answer it. 3 firefighters, Tom, Luke, and Brian, entered the house. They appeared just as relaxed as before. Tom even gave John a polite nod as if to say, "Good evening." John gave a curt reply and stayed in the kitchen. His heart raced as he heard the living room door close behind them. This time, Sarah closed it firmly, leaving no crack to peek through. Eavesdropping near the door, John caught snippets of their conversation. Then he heard Tom's voice. "What if he finds out? Are you sure it's worth it?" John couldn't hold back any longer. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. What he saw left him stunned. Tom stood in the center of the room, holding a paper script. Luke and Brian were sitting on the couch, and Sarah, her arms crossed over her chest, appeared focused as she gave them some instructions. "What the hell is going on?" John blurted out, his voice a mixture of anger and confusion. Sarah lifted her head and gave him a cold stare. "It's a rehearsal. We're preparing a play for the fire department's charity event. You've just ruined our momentum." John couldn't believe his eyes. He stared silently as Luke slowly stood and said, "I told you he wouldn't handle it." "A rehearsal?" John asked, glancing at the script in Tom's hands. Sarah walked closer to him, her expression calm, though her eyes sparkled with something akin to defiance. "Yes, and it's really none of your business, unless you'd like to join our club?" The words sounded far too playful, and John felt his anger rising. But he chose not to lose control. "If it's a rehearsal, then why does it seem so intimate?" he asked. Sarah let out a deep sigh, as if explaining the obvious to someone slow. "We're working on a scene where the main character cheats on her husband. It's drama. It's art. If you don't understand that, John, then don't interfere." John stood there for another moment, trying to determine if this was the truth or just an elaborate ruse. His eyes met Tom's, whose gaze carried a faint hint of triumph. Returning to the kitchen, John felt cornered. Everything seemed too well orchestrated, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be more than just a play. That night, he couldn't sleep. Tom's words about it being worth it echoed in his mind. The next morning, John decided to check on the charity event Sarah had mentioned. He called the fire station and asked about the play. On the other end of the line, he was told no such event was planned. It was another blow. His suspicions returned stronger than ever, and this time, he resolved to act more decisively. The following morning, Sarah once again donned her performance black dress and announced that she was heading to another rehearsal. She didn't look nervous or worried after the previous evening's events. On the contrary, her calm demeanor made John even more suspicious. He pretended to believe her, merely nodding at her words. As the door closed behind her, John quickly grabbed his jacket, keys, and rushed to his car. He decided to follow her to see where she was really going. Sarah drove away from the house, heading toward the city center. John followed her at a safe distance. Her route was peculiar. She passed the fire station and then turned toward a quieter neighborhood filled with old houses and an air of seclusion. Finally, she stopped in front of a large mansion with a high fence. John parked a bit further away, watching as Sarah approached the gate and pressed the doorbell. Within seconds, the door opened, and she was led inside. John felt a chill run through him. He knew this wasn't the fire station, nor was it a theater. The house looked more like a venue for elite gatherings or private parties. He decided to proceed cautiously. Stepping out of his car, John approached the gate, trying to stay unnoticed. Through a small gap in the fence, he saw Sarah talking to 2 men, one of whom was unmistakably Tom. They exchanged quick smiles before she disappeared inside the house. John decided to wait. He stood by the fence, listening to the muffled voices and laughter coming from inside. After a few minutes, he heard the sound of music, and then the door opened as Brian stepped out into the yard, holding a glass in his hand. "Strange to see you here," John heard a voice behind him. He turned around and saw Luke standing on the sidewalk, looking at him with a smirk. "What's going on here?" John asked sharply, trying to mask his embarrassment. Luke raised his hands as if surrendering. "It's just a gathering of old friends." "You're too tense." "Old friends?" John glanced at the house. "Then why didn't she tell me about it?" Luke shrugged. "Some things are better left between those involved." This answer infuriated John even more. Luke seemed to be deliberately trying to confuse him. Suddenly, John heard someone laughing loudly from inside the house. He recognized Sarah's laugh. It wasn't just any laugh, but the one she used when she was genuinely pleased. "I need to know the truth," John said, not taking his eyes off Luke. "Then go in and see for yourself," Luke said with a smile that was both an invitation and a challenge. John hesitated. To go inside would mean exposing himself, but staying outside would leave him with his own maddening speculations. He took a step toward the gate, but suddenly heard Sarah's voice from inside. "Are you sure we'll make it on time?" John stopped in his tracks. What were they planning? And why did she look so relaxed, as if everything was completely normal? A few minutes later, people began to leave the house. Sarah walked out with Tom, and they looked far too close. She lifted her head and spotted John. She froze in place. Sarah froze when she saw John at the gate. Her smile disappeared, replaced by something between surprise and worry. Tom, standing beside her, looked much calmer. He even smiled briefly, as if he were playing a game where every move was premeditated. John slowly approached them, feeling anger pulsing in his chest. "What kind of surprise is this, Sarah?" he asked, his voice colder than the winter wind. Sarah nervously looked away but quickly composed herself. "John, you weren't supposed to come here. This is part of a big surprise for you." "A surprise?" he repeated, his anger rising. What kind of surprise involves 3 firefighters, closed doors, and lies? Sarah tried to place a hand on his shoulder, but he stepped back. "It's related to the charity event. I wanted to do something special for you, but now it's ruined." "A charity event?" John laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. "I called the fire station. There's no event." Sarah looked confused for just a moment, but then tried to change her tactic. "This was a private initiative. You wouldn't understand." Tom stepped forward, attempting to mediate. "Maybe we can all calm down?" "John, there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing suspicious here." John turned to Tom, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you think I'll believe you? I see how you look at my wife, and how she looks at you." Sarah tried to explain again, but John wasn't listening anymore. He walked into the house, his gaze meeting the other guests. Inside, everything looked too luxurious. Glasses of champagne, dim lighting, casual laughter. This didn't look like a rehearsal or a charity meeting. "What's really going on here?" John demanded loudly, silencing the room. The guests began exchanging uneasy glances. Tom seemed to lose his confidence, but Sarah quickly approached John. "Do you want to know the truth?" she asked, looking him straight in the eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted," he replied, his voice rising. "We were preparing a play," she said quickly, "but you're so against everyone that you don't even let me explain." John couldn't hold back any longer. "A play? Then why does this look like an exclusive party? Why wasn't I informed?" Sarah lowered her eyes, but her voice remained firm. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand." That was the last straw. John stepped back and looked at Tom, who now stood silently along with the other guests. "It's all lies," John said, "and I'll prove it." Sarah stepped forward, but John walked out of the house without looking back. That night, sitting in his car nearby, he decided to wait. Wait to see who would leave and what was really happening behind those closed doors. John sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart raced, and his thoughts swirled in a chaotic dance. Time passed slowly, each minute of waiting only fueling his anger. He felt like he was starting to understand more than he ever wanted to know. Suddenly, the house door opened, and Sarah stepped outside. She looked tired, but her walk was steady. John watched as she glanced around, as if ensuring no one followed her. Her gaze stopped on his car, and she quickly approached. "We need to talk," she began as John rolled down the window. "Finally," he replied, his voice cold. "You can start with the truth." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to appear confident. "It's not what you think, John. All of this is for you." "For me?" John smirked sarcastically. "What a joy. Then maybe you can explain why you're putting on a play with these heroes?" She lowered her eyes as if gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to do something extraordinary, to stage a show where you're the main character. But it takes time and a team. And Tom. And champagne glasses. And lies," John interrupted, his sarcasm cutting. Sarah looked as if she might cry, but her voice remained calm. "Tom is just helping. And so is everyone else. I know how it looks, but you need to trust me." John leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "Trust? That ended the first time you lied." Her shoulders slumped, but she quickly regained her composure. "Then go and see for yourself if you don't believe me." Sarah turned away and walked back to the house, leaving the door open behind her. Her steps were slow but confident, like someone who knew she had something to hide. John waited a few minutes for his emotions to settle, then stepped out of the car. He walked to the door and entered. The air inside felt tense, different from before. Inside, he saw a different scene. The guests were still there, but now they seemed restrained, their conversations muted. Sarah stood next to Tom, and they were whispering about something. "You're back?" she asked when she saw John. "Yes. And this time, I'm not leaving until I know the whole truth." At that moment, a man John hadn't seen before entered from another room. He was tall, with gray hair, dressed in an expensive suit. His confident gaze and calm smile silenced everyone. "And who's this?" John asked, staring directly at the man. Sarah and Tom exchanged quick glances, but remained silent. The stranger stepped closer and extended his hand. "My name is Richard. I'm the organizer of this meeting." "And what exactly are you organizing?" John asked, ignoring the handshake. Richard smiled. "Something far greater than you can imagine. But perhaps your wife should be the one to tell you." John turned to Sarah, who stood silently, as though searching for the right words. "John," she began but fell silent when Richard gestured for her to stop. "If you want to know the truth, I'll show you," Richard said and motioned for John to follow him to another room. Sarah tried to intervene, but Richard looked at her with a gaze that silenced her instantly. John hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity and anger won out. He nodded at Richard, who led him through a corridor to a heavy door that seemed far too secure for an ordinary house. Richard turned to John before opening it. "Are you ready to see something that might change your life?" John clenched his jaw, trying to mask his anxiety. "Open it." As the door slowly swung open, John was confronted with a large room filled with monitors, cameras, and folders scattered across tables. On one of the screens, he saw footage recorded in their own living room. Sarah was sitting on the couch, talking with Tom. "What is this?" John's voice was tense, almost breaking. Richard walked around the room, gesturing for John to step inside. "This is just part of the work we do." "Work?" John felt his anger begin to boil. "What kind of work requires hidden cameras in my house?" Richard sighed, as though this was something he had explained many times before. "You have to understand that sometimes achieving certain goals requires a bit of risk." John started inspecting the room. On one of the tables, he saw photos of Sarah with various men, including Tom, Luke, and Brian. They all appeared to be part of some elaborate game. "What are these goals?" John turned to Richard. "And why is my wife involved in this?" Richard nodded toward one of the monitors, which displayed a video of Sarah sitting at a table, discussing something with Richard and other participants. Her voice was confident, and she appeared in a light John had rarely seen before. Serious, commanding, almost cold. "Sarah has a certain talent for," Richard paused, choosing his words carefully, "influencing people. Sometimes that becomes part of more complex projects." "Projects?" John almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. I never agreed to let our house or our family be part of your projects. Richard stepped closer, but Sarah made a choice, and it seems she didn't make it in your favor. Those words struck John like lightning. He turned to the table, grabbed one of the folders, and opened it. Inside were documents with detailed information about Sarah, her personal details, photographs, transcripts of conversations. What does all this mean? He asked, lifting his gaze to Richard. It's part of a larger game, John. But the question is, are you ready to be a player? At that moment, the door behind them opened, and Sarah entered the room. Her eyes widened in shock, but she quickly composed herself. John, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, he replied, holding the folder in his hands. Sarah stepped forward, but Richard raised his hand to stop her. I think it's time you told him everything. Sarah looked conflicted, but after a moment, she sighed and said, Fine, but you have to understand, this isn't what you think. John frowned. I've heard that before. Start talking. She slowly approached one of the tables and picked up a folder. All of this started a long time ago. I was offered a job that required unconventional methods. I couldn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't approve. And this job involves lying, hidden cameras, and Tom? John interrupted her. Sarah lowered her eyes. It was part of the plan. Richard intervened. You might not realize it, but Sarah was helping us influence the decisions of important people. Her charisma, her abilities, they were essential to our goals. John stared at her, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. So, what now? Sarah took a step toward him, but he stepped back. Her eyes were filled with desperation. I wanted to protect you, to protect us. John remained silent, unsure of what to say. Sarah stood across from him, her face tense, her eyes a mixture of fear and hope. She knew that whatever she said now could destroy their lives forever. John's silence was deafening, but his gaze said it all. He wasn't about to forgive without the truth. John, I swear, everything I've done. It was for us, she began. Her voice sounded firm, but her trembling hands betrayed her emotions. For us. John glanced at the monitors, still playing recordings of her conversations with Tom. You call this care? Sarah took a deep breath, searching for the right words. Richard offered me an opportunity that would help us financially. I didn't want to hide it, but I knew you wouldn't understand. Why would I have to understand? Were you betraying me? His voice cut through the room like a knife, causing even Richard to turn away. Sarah closed her eyes as tears rolled down her face. No, nothing happened between us. It was all part of the job. I had to appear convincing. John clenched his fists. You expect me to believe this was all an act? That every glance, every smile, every meeting was just work? Richard unexpectedly intervened, his voice calm but commanding. Perhaps you should consider the bigger picture. The bigger picture? John turned to him. You've destroyed my family, and now you're talking about perspective? Richard smiled, but it was cold and detached. John, you're right. There's a shadow over this story. But are you ready to use it to your advantage? What are you suggesting? John frowned. Richard gestured toward the table, where a new folder lay waiting. You have a choice. You can walk away and leave all this behind, but then you'll lose more than just your marriage. Or you can join us. John felt his heart race again. Join you? For what? For the game, Richard replied. Sarah has proven herself to be an incredibly skilled participant, but we value you as well. Together, you can create something far greater than just a family. Sarah looked shocked. Richard, we didn't discuss this. We're discussing it now, he replied sharply. John looked at Sarah. He searched her eyes for something that might confirm her sincerity, but all he saw was a mixture of fear and shame. What exactly are you offering? He asked, his voice cold and controlled. Richard leaned back against the wall. It's simple. You become part of our organization. We'll provide you with everything you need, money, power, security. In return, you help us in our work. John leaned in closer. And if I refuse? Richard tilted his head, his smile vanishing. Then you lose everything. Sarah rushed to John, her eyes filled with pleading. John, I don't want to lose you. Please, Believe me, I only wanted us to have a better life. A better life? John stepped back. How can you talk about a better life when you've betrayed everything we had? Richard raised a hand, silencing their argument. You can discuss this later, but the decision must be made now. John was silent. His thoughts swirled around everything he had seen and heard. His trust in Sarah was shattered, but he couldn't entirely let her go. He took a deep breath and looked at Richard. Give me time. Richard nodded, but not too much. John left the room, leaving Sarah and Richard behind. He sat in his car but couldn't bring himself to drive away. His world was crumbling, and he didn't know if there was any way to save even part of it. Meanwhile, inside the house, Sarah looked at Richard. You shouldn't have involved him in this. He didn't have a choice, Richard replied coldly. Neither did you. John couldn't simply leave it all behind. His marriage was falling apart, his life had lost its stability, and the truth he was trying to uncover seemed more tangled than ever. He decided to check into a hotel to think over his next steps, but thoughts of Sarah and Richard's words haunted him. Late that evening, while sitting at the hotel bar, a man he had never seen before approached him. Tall and lean, with sharp features and a deep voice, the man sat beside John as though they were old acquaintances. You're John, right? The stranger asked, ordering a drink. Depends on who's asking, John replied, his eyes fixed on the man. My name is Mark. I used to work with Richard, and trust me, he's not who he claims to be. These words sparked suspicion in John. You'll need to explain. Mark smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. Richard is a master manipulator. He finds people with vulnerabilities and exploits them for his purposes. Your wife is one of his greatest finds. You're saying he's forcing her to do this? John leaned closer, his voice quiet but tense. Mark nodded. He makes her believe she has no choice. At first, it seems like an opportunity, but over time, it becomes a trap. John fell silent, processing what he'd just heard. He recalled Sarah's words about wanting to protect them. Now those words sounded entirely different. If that's true, why didn't she just leave? John asked. Because Richard knows how to keep people under his control. Threats, manipulation, sometimes even emotional blackmail. He makes them feel like there's no way out, Mark explained. John stared at his glass. He wanted to find a reason not to believe Mark, but every word he said seemed to fit into the puzzle John had been piecing together. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because I was in your position once, Mark replied. And I lost everything. John didn't respond. His mind was working at full speed. If Mark was telling the truth, then Sarah might not only be a victim but also a complicit participant who had chosen to stay silent about her predicament. What do you suggest I do? John finally asked. Mark leaned in closer. First, find out how deep she's involved. Then decide. Help her get out or walk away forever. John knew he couldn't make this decision on the spot. He needed more information. The next morning, John returned to the house where the meeting had taken place. He walked through the same doors, and this time he didn't hold back his anger. In the living room, a few people were seated, including Richard and Sarah. We need to talk, John said, looking directly at his wife. Sarah looked surprised but quickly composed herself. John, I've explained everything I could. You've explained nothing, he replied. I know you're not doing this of your own free will. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, panic flashed across her face. What are you talking about? About Richard, John said, glancing at the man. He's using you. Richard stood from his seat, his voice calm but steely. That's a serious accusation, John. Do you have proof? John looked at Sarah, but she remained silent. I don't need proof. Her eyes say more than any documents could, he said. Then you need to decide what you want next, Richard replied coolly. John stepped closer to his wife. Sarah, I want the truth. All of it. Now. She seemed cornered, and her voice cracked as she said, John, I can't. He clenched his fists, struggling to control his anger. Then I'll find out myself. John couldn't wait to start taking action. His meeting with Mark had opened his eyes to what was really happening. His wife might not only be a victim but also a player in the game orchestrated by Richard. And if that was true, The only thing left for him to do was find a way to destroy the system. He called Mark and arranged to meet at a small cafe outside the city. Mark arrived on time, his expression serious and his voice resolute. "Do you really want to do this?" Mark asked as he sat across from John. "Yes, but I need your help. I want Sarah out of this," John replied, looking him straight in the eye. Mark nodded. "If you want to save her, you'll have to take risks. Richard doesn't let his people go easily." John leaned in closer. "What needs to be done?" Mark pulled out a tablet and opened a schematic. "He has a few weak spots. The most important is his archive. It's where he keeps all the information on his people, documents, videos, recorded conversations. If we can get into that archive, we can use it against him." "And how do we get in?" John asked. Mark gave him a look filled with doubt. "You'll have to go back to the house. But this time, undercover." John was silent for a few seconds, processing what he'd heard. He knew it was dangerous, but there was no other way. That evening, John returned home. Sarah was sitting in the kitchen, looking tired, but she quickly stood up when she saw him. "John, I'm glad you're back," she said, trying to step closer. He didn't back away, but he didn't respond to her gesture either. "We need to talk." Sarah stopped, her face filled with tension. "I know what you're thinking, but you have to understand me." "Then explain," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Why did you do it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "At first, it seemed innocent. Richard offered a job that could help us. I didn't think it would go this far." "And you couldn't tell me?" His voice was laced with disappointment. "I was afraid you wouldn't understand," she replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're right. I don't understand," John said, taking a step back. "But I'm going to fix it." Sarah looked bewildered. "What do you mean?" "I have a plan," he said, "but I need your help." Sarah was silent, her gaze wavering between fear and hope. "If you want to help me, you have to tell me the whole truth." Sarah swallowed nervously. "Okay, I'll tell you." She sat down across from him, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "Richard, he made me think it was the only way. I had to attend meetings, record conversations, influence people. I didn't want to, but he threatened to destroy us if I refused." "How exactly could he do that?" John asked, his eyes cold. "He has recordings that could ruin my reputation," she answered. "And not just mine." John realized it was even more complicated than he'd thought. "We can stop this," he said, "but you'll have to trust me." Sarah nodded, but a shadow of doubt remained in her eyes. The next day, they began to act. John and Mark developed a plan to break into the archive. Sarah was tasked with distracting Richard while John and Mark worked on hacking into the system. When everything was ready, John looked at Sarah. "This is our chance. We have to take it." "I'm scared," she admitted. "Then trust me, just as I'm trusting you now," he replied. They didn't know how it would end, but one thing was certain. Their marriage would never be the same again. A late-night fog blanketed the city, shrouding everything in a thick, eerie haze. John and Mark stood outside an unremarkable building known as the Archive. The place was well hidden, but Mark knew how to get inside. He pulled a key card from his pocket and looked at John. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes filled with doubt. "I've never been more ready," John replied, clenching his fists. The door unlocked with a quiet click, and they stepped into a dark corridor. The floor was cold, the walls sterile, and the air filled with the hum of servers. John felt the tension grow with every step. They moved quickly, following Mark's instructions. There was no security in sight, but the absence of it felt suspicious. John gripped his flashlight tightly, trying to suppress the thoughts of what might be waiting for them. When they reached the central room, Mark inserted the keycard into a terminal, and the monitors in front of them lit up. Data flooded the screens. Names, photos, files. John spotted a folder labeled Sarah, and a chill ran through him. "That's it," he said, pointing to the screen. Mark nodded and began copying the data onto a flash drive. But suddenly, a sound echoed down the corridor. Heavy footsteps reverberated against the walls. "We're not alone," Mark whispered, his face frozen in tension. John turned around. In the doorway stood a tall man in a black suit, his expression unreadable. His eyes seemed empty, yet they held a disturbing sense of certainty. "Did you really think you could just walk in here?" The man's voice was deep, almost hypnotic. John's heartbeat quickened. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. "My name is Gregor. I'm here to ensure you don't leave with what doesn't belong to you." Mark tried to hide the flash drive, but Gregor noticed the movement and took another step forward. "Hand it over, and I promise this will end peacefully." "Peacefully?" John laughed, but there was more fear than confidence in his voice. "How can it end peacefully when you work for Richard?" "I don't work for Richard," Gregor replied, his face remaining stoic. "I work for the truth." Those words caught John off guard. "What do you mean?" Gregor paused, as if considering the best way to respond. "You think you know the truth about Sarah, but you only have part of the story. You know she's involved, but you don't know why." John tensed. "And you're going to tell me?" Gregor smiled, but it was devoid of warmth. "Maybe, but not here." Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We don't have time for games." Gregor looked at him as if he were a child who didn't understand the rules. "The game started long ago, and you're not on the side you think you are." John felt his anger rising. "Then tell me, what side am I on?" Gregor tilted his head. "You're on the side of someone who still hasn't decided whether to trust Sarah." The words hit like a punch. John stared at him, feeling doubt creep back into his mind. "You have a choice, John," Gregor continued. "I can show you the truth, but it will cost more than you're ready to pay." Mark tugged at John's arm. "We can't trust him." John hesitated for a moment, then said, "Show me the truth." Gregor looked at John with an intense, almost piercing gaze. His eyes held cold certainty but also a hint of pity, as if he already knew that these words would change John's life forever. "You want to know the truth?" Gregor asked. "I don't believe the truth even exists anymore," John said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "It exists, but you're not ready to hear it," Gregor replied. "However, that doesn't matter, because you're going to hear it now." He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and inserted it into the terminal. The monitors lit up with video footage. John and Mark watched in silence. The first video showed Sarah sitting at a table with Richard. Her face was tense, but her eyes burned with determination. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Richard asked. "I have no other choice," Sarah replied. "I can't live in this chaos anymore." "What is this?" John's fists clenched, his heart pounding wildly. Gregor didn't answer and played the next video. This time, Sarah was in another room, talking to Tom. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said. "John doesn't suspect anything, but I feel like it's destroying me." Tom reached for her hand. "You're doing this for your future. If everything goes according to plan, you'll be free from it all." John felt a wave of anger rising within him. He turned to Gregor. "What does this mean?" Gregor stepped back, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. "It means Sarah approached Richard herself. She went to him looking for help." "What kind of help?" John's voice was nearly a shout. Gregor played the last video. In it, Sarah was sitting at a table with documents in front of her. She was signing something while Richard spoke. "This guarantees your safety," Richard said. "But remember, you have to hold up your end of the deal." "I'll do whatever it takes," Sarah replied, her voice cold and emotionless. John turned away from the monitors. His world was collapsing around him. "She told me she did it for us. That she was forced." "That's partially true," Gregor said. "But she did it for herself. She wanted out of the life you built together. It wasn't enough for her." John was silent, his hands trembling with rage. "Why are you showing me this?" he finally asked. "Because you need to decide what to do next," Gregor replied. "Richard manipulated both of you, but Sarah isn't an innocent victim." Mark, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "We can use this data to take Richard down, but you have to understand, it will destroy Sarah as well." John turned back to the screens, staring at his wife's face. He no longer recognized her. "What do you suggest?" he asked Gregor. "We can strike a deal," Gregor said. "You help me take down Richard, and I'll provide you with the evidence to protect Sarah. But you have to decide if she's worth it." The words hung in the air, filling the room with tension. John didn't know who he could trust anymore, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave things as they were. John returned home with the flash drive, which felt as heavy as a burden in his pocket. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew these recordings would destroy whatever remained of his marriage. Sarah was sitting in the living room, her face tense, her eyes lacking the light they had just weeks ago. "You're late," she said, trying to smile, but her voice trembled. "We need to talk," John replied, standing and refusing to sit. Sarah froze, her face going pale. She knew that tone. It could only mean one thing. He knew. "John," she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I saw everything," he said. "The recordings, the conversations, the deal with Richard." Sarah staggered as if she'd been struck. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly gathered herself. "It's not what you think," she said, taking a step toward him. "No?" His voice was icy. "Then explain why you went to him on your own. Why you chose lies over talking to me." Sarah paused for a moment, her lips trembling. "John, I was trapped. Richard, he manipulated me." "Manipulated?" John interrupted. "Or did you let him do it?" Sarah sat down, lowering her head. "I did it for us." John frowned. "For us? You call this for us? Lies, secret meetings, deals I couldn't even imagine?" She lifted her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I could control it, but it all became too much." "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. "I was afraid," she replied. "Afraid you wouldn't understand." John laughed, but there was no joy in his laugh. "You were right. I don't understand, and I never will." She stepped closer to him, trying to reach for his hand, but he stepped back. "John, I love you. I only wanted the best for us." "Then why do I feel like you chose something else?" he said, looking her straight in the eyes. Sarah fell silent, and the room was filled with a heavy, deafening silence. "You don't even know what to say anymore, do you?" he continued. "Because you know I'm right." Sarah lowered her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I wanted to save us, but I lost everything," she whispered. John stood there for a moment, staring at her, then turned and walked to the door. "John, where are you going?" she cried, rushing after him. "I don't know," he replied without stopping, "but I know I can't stay here." Sarah remained at the door, watching as he disappeared into the darkness. John never came back. Sarah lost him, along with the trust she could never regain. Richard avoided accountability, continuing his manipulations from the shadows. And John was left with questions that would never be answered. Was the truth worth the price? What would you have done in John's place? Would you have walked away forever, or given Sarah another chance?